Okay, first of all, I would like to apologize because I don't speak Italian. I can't even say I don't speak Italian in Italian. Can I please ask the people in the room who don't understand me to raise their hand? No hand goes up, excellent, so I assume everyone can understand me and my English. Brilliant. Can I please ask people in the room to put their hand up if you work in the construction sector? Who works in construction? I mean the entire thing. I mean client, supplier, engineering, architecture, software, manufacturing. A lot of hands are going up. Excellent. Who in this room? Brilliant. So I can liven up a bit. Okay, so excellent. Who in this room is currently working on a BIM project? Wow. Excellent. Can I ask the people who have not put their hand up, are you working on projects at all? Yeah, more or less? From the people who just put their hands up, working on a BIM project, how do you know? How do you know that you're working on a BIM project? Because someone said it? Someone said this is a BIM project, so it must be one? How do you know you work in BIM? Who recognizes a BIM project when you see one? Yeah?
We have a flux of information together with the modeling part.
Okay.
We have a kind of a process that organizes information in the model.
Excellent, thank you. I'll repeat it for the room. So we were talking about information. There was models mentioned, and there was a process mentioned. Excellent. Yeah, that's a very good start. So that is what we're talking about. And thanks to all my my previous speakers for setting the scene so nicely. So we talked about digitalization. We talked about Industry 4.0. We talked about the challenges for the sector and the journey we are all on. So I don't have to repeat that. That's brilliant. And that saved us some time. So I hope we can break for lunch after 3 hours in this room, and I really admire you and your attention, and you still have the energy to listen to me now. Okay, let's go through that. Let's look at BIM from a European Commission's perspective, from a European market perspective, and we heard this morning from Lorenzo about China, about the Asian market, and about the pressure that is now coming also onto Europe and the European countries when it comes to digitalization and the construction market. So, okay, good, you know. So this we saw this morning already. We heard it from Pietro. We heard about the challenges for Europe. We heard about the big numbers. And what we haven't heard yet really about is the huge amount of waste that we all together produce when we work on construction projects. There is on average, what people say, 35% is waste. And that is alarming, and that is waste that comes from miscommunication, from duplication of data entry, and the lack of really consistent data flow across the different stakeholders on a project. We heard about that, so we can skip that. That is the decline of productivity in construction and the lack of digitalization in construction. That is a big alarm to the European Commission, and the Commission is concerned about the silos and the paper-based working that we still operate in. That was a report from World Economic Forum, from the Boston Consulting Group, looking at the likelihood and the impact of different technologies really coming into the market and happening and changing the market. And when you look at the top right corner, that's the highest likelihood to occur and the highest impact to have is seen as integrated BIM. There are other technologies such as drones, 3D printing, virtual reality, and none of them are seen to have such an impact on the market we all work in, such as integrated BIM. So what does that mean now? And we heard a lot about today about the challenges and everything else. So now looking at the clients, so who can really introduce that change and guide and help us through that change? Well, one of the answers certainly is the clients, and especially the public sector clients, because they are responsible for a huge amount of work in the construction sector, and they can create the environment that we all need. E-procurement, we heard already about that, so that is seen by the European Commission as a game changer and has achieved savings. And when we just look at 5 to 20%, it doesn't sound like much, but when we remember what we heard earlier, the construction market in Europe accounts for 1.2 trillion euros. So 20% of 1.2 trillion is an enormous number. So Public Procurement Directive we heard already, so we can go through that. Encourages the use of BIM, doesn't mandate the use of BIM. What the Commission is concerned about is the increasing number of national BIM programs. So when we look at the different nations, we see that most of the nations now are embarking on their strategic journey through an organization led by the public sector. But that's good, but and we'll skip that, what the risk is, if we don't collaborate and if we are not aligned in Europe, then we will slow down the market, we will confuse the market. And there comes China, and there comes East Asia, and there comes Australia and America. And what do we do in Europe? We argue, and we have 22 different legislations and 28 different ways of working and understandings of what BIM actually means. And that is the concern of the European Commission. And that was one of the reasons to put this EU BIM task group in place. EU BIM task group is an assembly of 22 nations represented by their public sector clients. It's either the ministries or the biggest procurers, like the rail companies, the road companies, and others. So our task is, within 2 years, to develop what we call the common framework for the introduction of BIM in the European construction sector. And our main deliverable is a handbook, is a guidance book. How do you do that? Where do you start, and how do you go about it when you are a government, a ministry, or when you are German Rail or Austrian Rail or SNCF? So our target group are the public estate owners, the public procurers, and the policy makers. This is who we are. So it's 22 nations have signed up and have submitted a letter of support to the Commission. This is how we work. So we start from the demand. Where is the demand? What is the need? We then talk to the enablers, the standardization bodies. We heard about ISO, CEN, the national standardization bodies, very, very important, but also academia and others. And then we also engage with the supply chain, because it is important that we all stick together and work together on this. Our timeline is that we started a year ago in February 2016. The first activity last year was a survey amongst our member states to understand where they are and what they do consistently already and where we diverge. This was the purpose of the survey. And we are at the moment finalizing the handbook. It was issued in a first draft to our 22 members. We received lots of comments, and we're now finalizing it. So, what is part of this handbook? First of all, we talk about the why. What is the value proposition for introducing BIM, and what is the value proposition for doing it in an aligned way across Europe? The second is the what. What should you do? Really helping nations, helping governments on their journey. Where do you start? What should you really do? And then the how, and that is really giving guidance, understand your needs, etc., etc. And I'll talk about that in a sec. Our methodology was we looked at certain activities, and from the survey that we did, we tried to understand, as I said, what are people and nations already doing in a consistent way, driven by standards and best practice, and what again is the value or the impact of an activity. And that's how we came up with this matrix of recommendations. Something is either highly recommended or encouraged. And as I said, we looked also at standards, because we are not redeveloping standards, we are using standards for the implementation. This is the survey I talked about, so 33 questions. Quite interesting results came out of that. So the survey was designed around these 4 points. We wanted to understand the status quo of the different nations. If they have a program for BIM, why? What drives them? What is their definition of BIM? Do they have a common understanding or different understanding of BIM? And what are the actions coming out of that? So from some of the questions here, so one question was, are you aware of the use of BIM in your country? And out of the 16 responses that we received, so one response per nation, a coordinated response per nation, 100% said, yes, we are aware of the use of BIM in our country. And also all 16 said, we see the use of BIM, the adoption of BIM has massively increased over the last 2 years. We then asked, how do you think is your market structured? And a majority said, well, we have some structure, but not really well. We then said, your programs, are they mostly driven by building sector or infrastructure sector or both or others? Because a lot of people perceive BIM still as a buildings-dominated sector, and the responses were different or surprisingly high, scored surprisingly high on the infrastructure side, which again is not surprising when you think that public sector clients are mostly infrastructure operators like railroad authorities, waterways, etc. And that's probably then less surprising. That's the public domain. We then asked, do you have a strategic program that you are implementing in your country? And out of the 16, 11 said, yes, we do. And we then asked, so how far are you? 3 nations said, oh, we are done. We've executed it. We're done with our work. I'm not 100% sure that this is right, to be honest. 6 said, we are implementing a program right now. And some others said, yeah, we've made progress, or we've just started, to be honest. The why is the important one. We then asked, okay, if you're doing something at a strategic level, why? What drives you? And that is important for the Commission, because you have a different conversation with someone who is purely led by investment costs, so costs for design and construction, maybe a bit of operations, compared to someone who is really concerned about the growth of a sector, keeping people employed, happiness of people, and growth of a nation, for example. And the Commission, they divide the drivers into the 3 sections here: economic drivers, environmental drivers, or social drivers. And then we put the responses into the categories: someone who is really concerned about building something, or operating something, or, as I said, guiding or leading a nation. And then we plotted the responses in this matrix here. And I know that Germany, for example, came up down here in the bottom left corner, purely driven by investment costs. They do say something like life cycle sometimes, but there's no recognition whatsoever about the real savings that can be achieved later on. Whereas nations like the UK or the Netherlands, they came up here because when you read their strategies, they talk about what we saw earlier. The construction strategy from the UK 2025 is about growth, is about savings, is about sustainability, livable cities, etc. So that's an interesting exercise to do, understanding what drives people to do it. What we do then in our recommendations that we put up at the strategic level, it's around these 4 corners here. And we heard about leadership earlier again. So having public leadership is very important. Having someone who explains what the drivers are, what the strategy is, who puts a vision behind it, who puts some money behind it, some guidance, leadership behind it is very important to drive something. Because if you want to have a conversation with 18 million people in this sector, it is very, very difficult. So starting from public leadership, we then say, but then you need to engage with your communities, with your industry. You need to put industry groups in place because different stakeholders have different drivers, different interests. You have a different conversation with the Association of Architects than you have with the Association of Contractors, for example. It's a completely different conversation. But you need to have them both and more. then you need some sort of framework. You might have to change legislation, you might have to change some rules, procurement rules, and other things. You need to put technical things in place, training in place, and all that is also should be a concern of the public sector and public leadership. And if you have all that in place, you can then start to grow the capacity across your market and across your industry, because we need more capacity in this field. We haven't got enough people who can actually implement all the stuff we saw this morning and we are talking about. So, and this is where I can't show you the details. I'm not allowed yet because they are not published. In BIM terminology, they are work in progress and therefore not to be shared with the project team or the public. But coming back to the methodology, I showed you earlier the matrix of highly recommended, and encouraged recommendations that we give. And for every bullet point you just saw here, you will find that in that matrix here, in that spreadsheet. And in the final version of the handbook, these boxes are filled with very clear recommendations, what people should do, what we highly recommend to do, or what we encourage to do. And then we will also provide case studies from different nations. How has it been done before, and what lessons can be learned from that? And we hope that the practical experience from nations or organizations that have gone through that and done it before will help people to understand what it means and to put the action in place.
When is the deadline for it? When can you publish it?
We are aiming for early July. There is a big event, and the Commission is aiming to use that event to launch the handbook. So it's not far off, and there's still a bit of work to do. Yeah. So we're building up for the event, yes. Good. And now I'm coming back to the question I asked you at the beginning. What is actually a BIM project? And do you recognize when you see one? And when we have a conversation about BIM, what do you have in mind? And is it the same that I have in mind? And that is something we observe everywhere in Europe, that very often people think they talk about the same thing, but they don't, and they're not clear about that. And this is also a big part of that handbook. We try to introduce a common, call it definition of BIM by defining different characteristics, so you can almost like check, like a tick box checking. Are we doing this? Yes. Are we doing this? Yes. So we are, like in the UK, they would say we are level 2 compliant. In Germany, they would say level 1 compliant, and we will introduce a European level, and everyone can check, are we compliant with the European level? So when the public sector procures a project Europe-wide, and they say, we want the European BIM level 1, or whatever we call that, then everyone will know what that means and what activities are required. Because when we look at the different things that we can do around the project lifecycle, there are loads. There are all these activities. They're starting from modeling in 3D with objects, attaching information to objects, developing or delivering data from 3D models, doing clash detection, doing 4D, 5D, taking data on site, handing over data to facilities management. So which of all these activities do you mean by saying we do BIM? And who defines that? And that the answer is the European Commission will put a recommendation to the procurers to be very consistent at the minimum activities they want to see. And again, I can't show you the criteria yet, but if you have heard or seen level 2 in the UK, if you've read the German roadmap to construction and you saw the criteria that are defined in there, which are very much similar to the UK ones. If you've seen the Dutch level definition, then you can make a very, very educated guess what will fill these boxes here. And also, and that is indicated by these ISO here, that again, we are signposting the standards. We are trying to encourage the adoption and the use of the standards that are being developed at CEN level, at ISO level, and UNI or DIN or wherever. So again, we are just trying to bring all this together and make it more understandable for people and tangible so that we all know what it means. The requirements will all be set around these 4 activity areas here, so we do need to change or adopt some regulations and policy We need to adopt different technology. Definitely the processes need to change, and we will require different skills. And we heard about that, and we need some sort of quality assurance, certification, accreditation around these activities as well, for sure. And in a similar way to what you saw earlier, the handbook will then contain these tables, and then for every criteria, again, we recommend what people should do, and also we provide case studies how people have done it already, because it's not really groundbreaking new what we're doing here. It is more summarizing what people are already doing and trying to give them a bit of a kickstart to do it quicker, better, and more aligned. So this is what will come very soon. And again, this is all about growth and a very strong European market, so that we all who work in the construction sector are still in jobs tomorrow and day after tomorrow. Thank you.